The scent of her perfume hit me before I even walked into the room, warm and floral and intoxicating. It wasn't the kind she usually wore, and that detail stuck in my head. Little things like that were starting to stick. Claire, my wife of 11 years, had been full of surprises lately, and not the kind that could be celebrated with roses and champagne. That night when I came home, she was sitting on the porch in her favorite sweater, staring into the darkness, her phone glowing in her lap. Her smile when she saw me was off. Like she'd forgotten how to look at me with anything other than polite warmth. "Long day?" I asked, kissing her cheek. Her answer was flat, rehearsed. "Same as usual." But I knew something was changing, even if I couldn't name it yet. Claire and I had always been good together, steady, reliable, the couple that everyone admired. I met her 13 years ago at a gallery opening when I was still fumbling my way through early adulthood. She was magnetic, with a laugh that turned heads and an easy confidence that put everyone in the room under her spell. I was hooked from the first moment she looked at me, tilting her head as if I were the most interesting man alive. We married 2 years later, and our life fell into place like clockwork. A charming house in Seattle with the wraparound porch Claire had insisted on. Her world of volunteer work and mine of designing glass and steel skyscrapers. For over a decade, we built a life of quiet success. It wasn't flashy, but it was ours. Claire, 37 now, poured herself into helping others. She chaired fundraisers, organized food drives, and was a pillar of our community. I admired her for it, though sometimes I felt like her energy went everywhere but to me. My job, demanding and all-consuming, didn't leave much room for doubt or anything else. We had a rhythm, a system that worked. Or so I thought. Looking back, I wonder how I didn't see it unraveling. I was so focused on work, on providing for us, that I ignored the subtle changes, the way Claire started leaving the house earlier and coming home later, her phone always in her hand, buzzing with messages I wasn't privy to. We still had our moments, a shared bottle of wine on the porch, mornings spent making pancakes together, but those moments were islands in a sea of distance. I told myself it was just the natural ebb and flow of marriage, that we were fine. After all, we still kissed goodbye every morning, still shared a bed every night. But cracks were forming, and I was too distracted to notice. Or maybe I just didn't want to. The night she came home smelling like a new perfume, I remember thinking how strange it was. Claire wasn't the type to change things without telling me, and yet here was this unfamiliar scent, soft and sweet, lingering in the air as she breezed past me into the kitchen. When I asked her about it, she smiled and said, "Oh, just something I picked up for a fundraiser." I nodded, letting it slide. But that scent clung to me, stirring something I couldn't quite put into words. I didn't know it yet, but the life I thought we'd built was already beginning to fall apart. And the worst part? I wasn't ready for what came next. The day I found the note, it wasn't anything special. A Thursday, unremarkable in every way. I'd left work early for once, something about a cancelled meeting and a rare urge to beat the rush hour chaos. I thought I might surprise Claire by making dinner, a small gesture to remind her I was still trying. She wasn't home when I arrived, which wasn't unusual. Her schedule was packed with volunteer events and charity meetings. I put my bag down, rolled up my sleeves, and grabbed her jacket from the back of the chair to hang it up. That's when I felt it, a crumpled piece of paper in the pocket. Curiosity is a funny thing. You tell yourself you're just tidying up, but then your fingers unfold the paper almost before your brain has time to argue against it. It was a small, handwritten note, the kind of thing you might tuck into a card or slip under someone's door. "You make everything brighter. Can't wait to see you again. J." I stared at it for a long time, my pulse quickening. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe it was meant for someone else. Maybe it was part of a fundraiser or a charity thank you. Claire's world was filled with people, after all. But then I thought about the perfume, the phone always buzzing, her late nights at meetings. My stomach knotted. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. This was Claire, my Claire. That night, when she came home, I tried to act normal. She breezed through the door, her hair damp from the rain, and smiled at me in a way that felt almost too casual. I wanted to ask her about the note, to hold it up and demand an explanation, but the words died in my throat. Instead, I said, "Hey, I thought I'd cook tonight." She looked surprised, then pleased. That's sweet, Daniel. What's the occasion? No occasion, I replied, forcing a smile. Just felt like it. Over dinner, I watched her closely. Every movement, every word. She seemed normal, too normal, if that makes sense. The Claire I knew had an openness to her, a warmth that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. But lately, there was something guarded about her, like she was holding something back. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. My rational side told me it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But another part of me, the part that had been catching the small, unspoken changes in her, whispered that it wasn't. I told myself I'd let it go. After all, Claire had never given me a reason to doubt her before. But as the days went on, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was off. She took more phone calls in private, her conversations filled with vague phrases and muffled laughter. When I asked her about her day, she gave me the highlights, but not the details. One evening, I came home to find her standing on the porch, her phone pressed to her ear. She didn't notice me at first, too caught up in whatever she was saying. "We'll have to be careful," she said softly, her voice low. Then, a laugh, light, intimate, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in a long time. When she saw me, she jumped, ending the call abruptly. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just someone from the shelter," she replied quickly, slipping her phone into her pocket. Her answer was plausible enough, but the look on her face told a different story. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. Claire was hiding something, and I needed to find out what. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the threads holding my world together began to unravel completely. My meeting schedule had been shuffled, leaving me with an unexpected block of free time. Instead of lingering at the office or grabbing a drink with a colleague, I decided to head home early, a rare decision for me but one that would change everything. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Claire's car wasn't there. It wasn't unusual for her to be out, but something about the empty space unsettled me. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to my imagination, and stepped into the house. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Normally, the house carried a kind of lived-in noise, music from Claire's speakers, the faint hum of her voice on the phone, or the rhythmic sounds of her moving about. Today, there was none of that. I walked through the house, half expecting her to be there, but every room was empty. The kitchen was spotless, the counters gleaming as if she'd just finished cleaning. My eyes caught on her tablet lying on the counter, its screen dark. Then it buzzed. The notification lit up the screen briefly, just long enough for me to see a name I didn't recognize. "Jason, missing you already." Today was incredible. I froze. Jason. My mind scrambled to place the name, to connect it to someone from Claire's work or volunteer circles, but I came up blank. A wave of unease washed over me, tightening my chest. I told myself to leave it alone, to respect her privacy. But then, another message popped up. "Jason, can't wait until next time. Thinking about you nonstop." My stomach churned. The words felt intimate, far too personal to be casual. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. I shouldn't have opened it. I know that now. But in that moment, I reached out and swiped the screen. Claire hadn't bothered to set a passcode. It was a small detail that once would have meant trust but now felt like a glaring oversight. The message thread opened before me, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The texts between Claire and Jason stretched back weeks. They weren't explicitly sexual, but they didn't need to be. The tone was unmistakable, a flirtatious, secretive warmth that I hadn't felt from Claire in years. "You looked amazing today. You always know how to make me laugh. I wish I could spend all day with you." My hands trembled as I scrolled, reading exchanges about meetups and shared moments I'd known nothing about. Lunches that weren't on her calendar. Afternoons where she was supposedly at charity events. Evenings when I'd been working late. My breathing quickened, my heart hammering against my ribs. This couldn't be real. Claire, the woman I'd built my life with, the person I trusted most, was having an affair. The realization hit me like a blow, and I sank into a chair, clutching the tablet. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. Who was Jason? How long had this been going on? And why? The texts didn't give me the full picture, but they were enough to shatter the illusion I'd been clinging to. Claire had been lying to me, slipping away piece by piece while I stayed blind to it all. Before I could process it further, I heard the unmistakable sound of her car pulling into the driveway. Panic shot through me. I scrambled to lock the tablet and set it back on the counter as if nothing had happened. Moments later, the door opened, and Claire walked in, carrying a bag of groceries. She looked radiant, her cheeks flushed from the cool air outside. "Hey, you're home early," she said, her voice light and cheerful. "Yeah," I replied, forcing my tone to stay even. "Had a light day." She smiled and set the bag on the counter, pulling out vegetables and chatting about some fundraiser she was working on. I watched her, my chest tight with the weight of what I now knew. She turned to look at me, her smile faltering. "You okay?" I wanted to ask her about Jason right then. I wanted to show her the messages and demand an explanation. But I couldn't. Not yet. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She accepted my answer without question, returning to her task as if nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Claire slept soundly beside me. The evidence was all there, glaring and undeniable, but I still didn't know the full extent of it. How far had things gone? Was it just texts and lunches, or was it more? I couldn't confront her without knowing the truth. If I was going to do this, I needed proof, real, solid proof. The next morning, as she left for another event, I resolved to find out everything. No more doubts, no more wondering. I needed answers, and I wouldn't stop until I had them. The morning after discovering the messages, I woke with a sense of purpose, even though the betrayal still burned deep. Claire had left early, her excuse a vague mention of a volunteer meeting. I knew better now. She was hiding something, and I wasn't about to let her keep me in the dark any longer. I spent the day reviewing everything I could remember from the past few months, her absences, the late-night phone calls, the times she'd brushed off my questions with practiced ease. Every moment that had seemed harmless at the time now felt suspicious, like puzzle pieces that I needed to fit together. But I couldn't confront her without real evidence. If this was going to be resolved, or destroyed, I needed the whole truth. That's when I decided to track her. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but the doubt had consumed me, leaving me with no other options. I purchased a GPS tracking device online, the kind that could be discreetly placed in her car. It arrived the next day, and while she was in the shower, I slipped it into the glove compartment of her SUV. The first few days of tracking didn't reveal much. She went to her usual spots, the shelter, the community center, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. For a moment, I wondered if I'd misinterpreted the texts, if I was reading into things that weren't there. Then, on Thursday, her routine changed. She left the house around noon, saying she was meeting a donor for lunch. I checked the GPS tracker an hour later, expecting to see her parked near one of the downtown restaurants she frequented. Instead, her car was at a location I didn't recognize, a small boutique hotel on the other side of town. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. There was no reason for her to be there, not for her work, not for anything I knew about. Unless, of course, she wasn't alone. I decided to follow her the next time she went there. The tracker gave me a pattern, every Thursday afternoon, like clockwork. The following week, I called in sick to work, parked a few blocks away from the hotel, and waited. Sure enough, her car pulled into the lot just after 1. She stepped out, dressed casually but with a level of care that felt deliberate, perfectly styled hair, subtle makeup, a jacket that hugged her in all the right ways. I watched from my car as she walked inside, checking her phone as she went. My heart pounded, a mix of fury and dread coursing through me. I didn't follow her inside. Not yet. Instead, I took photos, her car in the lot, her walking into the hotel. Evidence. Proof. Later that evening, I reached out to someone who could help me dig deeper, a private investigator named Aaron. He was no nonsense, the kind of guy who gives results without asking too many questions. I explained the situation, laying out everything I'd discovered so far, and handed him the photos. I need to know who this guy is, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Aaron nodded. Consider it done. The next week was agony. I avoided Claire as much as possible, keeping my distance and pretending everything was fine. She didn't seem to notice the shift, too preoccupied with her phone and her meetings. When Aaron finally called, his findings confirmed what I'd feared. "His name's Jason Carter," he said. "He's married, well, separated, and works as a project manager at some corporate firm downtown. He's been meeting your wife at that hotel every Thursday for the past 3 months. I've got photos, text records, even timestamps." Hearing it out loud, laid bare in cold, hard facts, was a gut punch. The man I'd only known through the screen of Claire's tablet now had a face, a life, a role in the betrayal that was dismantling my marriage. Aaron handed me a file the next day, thick with evidence, photographs of them together, timestamps of their rendezvous, and even an audio recording he'd managed to capture from their last meeting. I sat alone in my car, staring at the file in my lap, unsure whether to feel vindicated or completely destroyed. This was what I'd asked for, the truth, unfiltered and undeniable. But holding it in my hands made it feel even more real. That night, as Claire slept beside me, I opened the file again, flipping through the images and transcripts. Each word, each stolen moment between her and Jason, felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I had a plan. Claire wasn't the only one who could keep secrets. Once I had Aaron's report, the weight of what I'd discovered became almost unbearable. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore, it was about justice. Claire and Jason had built their little fantasy on lies, and I wasn't about to let them carry on without consequences. That's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to do this alone. Jason Carter was married, or at least, separated. His wife, Emma, deserved to know the truth. It didn't feel right to drag someone else into this, but I couldn't ignore the fact that she was a casualty of this betrayal too. If anyone could understand what I was going through, it was her. Aaron provided me with Emma's address, a modest brick house in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from mine. My palms were sweaty as I knocked on her door. She opened the door cautiously, her eyes narrowing as she took in the stranger on her porch. "Emma Carter?" I asked, my voice steady despite my nerves. "Yes," she said, hesitantly. "Can I help you?" "I'm Daniel Blake," I said, my words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself. "I'm married to Claire Blake. I think your husband, Jason, is having an affair with my wife." Her face froze, the blood draining from her cheeks. For a moment, I thought she might slam the door in my face, but instead, she stepped back, motioning for me to come in. We sat in her living room, the air heavy with tension. She didn't speak for a long time, her hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion like it was the only thing anchoring her. "Are you sure?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I pulled out Aaron's file, laying the evidence on the coffee table between us. Photos of Claire and Jason entering the hotel, screenshots of messages, timestamps. She stared at the images, her expression shifting from shock to heartbreak to fury. "I had a feeling," she murmured, shaking her head. "He's been distant for months. I thought maybe it was just the separation, but now." "I'm sorry," I said, genuinely meaning it. "I know how hard this is to see. But I thought you deserved to know." She looked up at me then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "At least now I know I wasn't crazy." Then Emma surprised me. "What are you planning to do about it?" she asked, a new edge to her tone. I hesitated. "I don't know yet. I wanted to confront Claire, but I don't think just talking will do anything. They've gotten away with this for too long." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then let's make sure they don't." It was the first time I'd smiled in weeks. "Are you saying you want in?" "I'm saying they've made fools of both of us," she said, her voice hardening. "If they think they can destroy 2 marriages and walk away unscathed, they're wrong." Together, we started to plan. Jason was scheduled to give a high-profile presentation at his firm's annual corporate event in a few weeks. Emma knew the details, time, place, even the layout of the venue. Claire, being Jason's partner in crime, would undoubtedly be there, standing by his side like nothing was wrong. Our plan was simple but devastating: expose their affair in the most public way possible. Emma and I spent hours going over the logistics, making sure everything would go off without a hitch. I gathered the evidence Aaron had provided, photos, texts, timestamps, and even a recording of a conversation between Jason and Claire that left no room for doubt. Emma, meanwhile, worked on getting access to the event. As Jason's estranged wife, she had enough leverage to secure an invitation without raising suspicion. Once inside, she'd set the plan into motion. The night of the event arrived faster than I expected. I was a bundle of nerves as I waited outside the venue, watching as sleek cars pulled up and well-dressed professionals streamed inside. Emma texted me just after 8 p.m., "They're here. Everything's ready." I could almost hear the determination in her words. This was it, the moment we would take back control. Jason took the stage around 8:30, his confidence practically radiating as he began his presentation. He spoke about innovation, leadership, and success, his voice smooth and commanding. Claire stood near the front of the room, dressed to perfection, her eyes locked on him with a smile. Emma waited until he reached the climax of his speech before stepping into action. From her seat at the back of the room, she discreetly activated a projector linked to her laptop. The screen behind Jason flickered, and then, suddenly, it wasn't his presentation slides on display anymore. It was the photos. Claire and Jason at the hotel. Messages exchanged between them. Proof of their meetings, their betrayal. Gasps filled the room as heads turned toward the screen. Jason froze mid-sentence, his face draining of color as he realized what was happening. Claire's smile vanished, replaced by sheer panic as she looked around the room. "What the hell is this?" someone in the audience muttered. Jason stammered, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The damage was done. Emma stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "This," she said, pointing to the screen, "is the man who talks about leadership and integrity while sleeping with another man's wife. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Jason Carter." The room erupted into chaos. Claire bolted for the exit, her heels clicking against the floor as she disappeared from view. Jason stood there, paralyzed, as his colleagues whispered and stared. I stayed outside, leaning against my car, waiting for the fallout to begin. My phone buzzed with a message from Emma, "It's done." And just like that, the truth was out. The chaos that followed the corporate event rippled through our lives with the force of a hurricane. Jason's career, his carefully constructed image of professionalism and leadership, crumbled overnight. By the time the event ended, word of the affair had already begun to spread. Within 24 hours, Jason was called into a meeting with his company's board. From what Emma later told me, the meeting was brutal. The board members, furious over the scandal, demanded his resignation. His actions weren't just a personal failing, they were a public relations nightmare. By the end of the week, Jason was officially unemployed, his career in shambles. Claire didn't fare much better. The network of friends and colleagues she'd carefully built through her volunteer work began to distance themselves. The whispers started almost immediately, fueled by the photos and messages Emma and I had made public. Claire's name, once associated with generosity and leadership, now carried a different weight. The morning after the event, Claire came home to face me. She walked into the house slowly, her face pale and drawn. For a moment, she stood in the doorway, clutching her bag like it was the only thing holding her together. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't bother to look up from the table, where the file of evidence still lay open. "I think we've said everything that needs to be said." "Daniel, please," she pleaded, sitting down across from me. Her hands trembled as she reached for mine, but I pulled away. "Please what, Claire?" I asked, my voice cold. "Please forget that you lied to me. That you betrayed me. That you let me believe we still had a marriage while you were sneaking around with Jason." Her eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't like that." Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't insult me by trying to justify it." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. "Why, Claire?" I finally asked, my voice quieter now. "Why him? Why any of this?" She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "I don't know," she admitted. "You were always so busy, always so distant." "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "It just happened." "That's not how it works," I said, standing up. You don't just fall into someone else's bed by accident. You chose this, Claire. Over and over again. She reached for me, but I stepped back, the distance between us now more than just physical. I think you should go, I said. Her face crumpled, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. Daniel, please. We can fix this. No, Claire, I said firmly. You had your chance to work on this marriage, and you threw it away. There's nothing left to fix. For a moment, she sat there, stunned. Then, without another word, she stood up and walked out. In the days that followed, I began the process of unraveling our lives together. I contacted my lawyer to initiate divorce proceedings, ensuring everything was documented. Claire didn't fight me on it. I think she knew she'd lost whatever ground she might have had. Meanwhile, Emma and I kept in touch. What had started as a shared pain evolved into a kind of strange camaraderie. She was still dealing with Jason's fallout, navigating the wreckage of her own life while trying to protect her two young kids from the worst of it. Jason tried to reach out to her, apologies, promises, and even threats, but Emma was resolute. She filed for divorce within a week of the event, cutting ties with him entirely. As for me, the house, once filled with memories of Claire, began to feel suffocating. Everywhere I turned, I saw reminders of her, the framed photos on the mantel, the books she'd insisted on keeping in the living room, even the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I started packing things up, boxing away pieces of a life that no longer felt like mine. One evening, as I was sorting through old photos, Emma called. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice soft. "Surviving," I said, managing a small smile she couldn't see. "You?" "Same," she replied. There was a pause, and then she added, "You know, it's strange. For the first time in months, I feel free. Like I can finally start over." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Free. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but she was right. Claire's betrayal had broken me, yes, but it had also given me something I hadn't realized I needed, a clean slate. "Maybe we both can," I said, my voice steadier now. Emma laughed lightly. Maybe. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. The process was cleaner than I'd anticipated. Claire didn't contest it. I think she knew fighting would only prolong the inevitable, and maybe, deep down, she felt she didn't have the right. We divided the assets without much drama, and I kept the house. Once it was officially over, a strange calm settled over me. The kind of quiet that follows a storm, when the damage is done, but the air is still heavy with what's been lost. The house, however, didn't feel like home anymore. Every corner held memories of Claire, good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. I decided to sell it, to let go of the place that had once represented our dreams but now felt like a monument to what we destroyed. Packing was harder than I expected. Going through years of shared life, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind, felt like sifting through the rubble of something once beautiful. There were moments when I'd come across a photo or a note she'd written and feel a pang of loss so sharp it took my breath away. But each time, I reminded myself that this was necessary. Moving forward meant letting go. Emma and I kept in touch, though not as frequently as in the immediate aftermath of the corporate event. She was busy rebuilding her life, too, finalizing her divorce, finding a new home for herself and her 2 kids. One day, about 6 months after everything had come crashing down, she called me out of the blue. "Hey, stranger," she said, her voice lighter than I'd ever heard it. "How's life post-Claire?" "Quiet," I admitted, laughing softly. But not in a bad way. "And you?" "Busy," she replied. "But good busy. I think we're finally settling into our new normal." Her words reminded me of something I'd been meaning to tell her. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said. About starting over. I've been looking at places out of the city, smaller, quieter. Somewhere I can really start fresh." "Good for you," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "You deserve it." A month later, I closed on a small cabin near a lake about 2 hours from Seattle. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The mornings were peaceful, the evenings quiet, and the air smelled of pine and fresh water. It was exactly what I needed, a place where I could breathe again, away from the noise of the life I'd left behind. I spent my days working remotely and my weekends hiking trails and fixing up the cabin. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. It wasn't much, just journal entries and half-finished stories, but it felt good to let my thoughts flow without judgment. One weekend, Emma and her kids came to visit. It was the first time we'd seen each other in person since the event, and though the circumstances of our meeting had been painful, our connection now felt natural, easy. "Wow," Emma said as she looked around the cabin, her youngest tugging at her sleeve. "This is perfect." "It's getting there," I said, smiling. "Still needs a lot of work." She laughed. "Doesn't everything?" We spent the afternoon kayaking on the lake, the kids laughing and splashing each other while Emma and I watched from a distance. It was the first time in a long while that I felt truly present, unburdened by the weight of the past. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lake in hues of orange and gold, Emma turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way," she said. "So have you," I replied. We didn't say anything else after that, just sat in comfortable silence as the day faded into night. Months turned into a year, and life began to feel like mine again. The pain of Claire's betrayal hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. I'd learned to live with it, to see it as a chapter in my life rather than the whole story. Emma and I stayed close, though neither of us was in a rush to define what we were to each other. We'd both been through enough to know that healing took time, and whatever came next would happen naturally. Looking back, I realized that losing Claire, as painful as it was, had forced me to confront things about myself I'd been avoiding for years. My workaholic tendencies, my tendency to take the people I loved for granted, it all came into focus. In the end, the betrayal had broken me, but it had also set me free. One crisp autumn morning, as I sat on the porch of my cabin with a cup of coffee in hand, I watched the fog roll over the lake and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Sometimes, the hardest things we endure lead us to the places we're meant to be. Do you think Daniel's decision to expose Claire and Jason publicly was justified, or did it cross a moral line? What would you have done in his place? Write in the comments.